So I welcome all of you here. My name is Richard Bass, and I coordinate the group that is bringing this event to you, called PALS, which stands for Planning Ahead for LGBT Seniors and Allies, and seniors in the broadest sense, because we're all senior to someone, and future seniors are definitely very, very important. So it's seniors in the broadest sense of all. A little bit of housekeeping. We will keep you on mute probably. And we are going to go straight through until 11 with the presentation. If you are available, the panel will stay after 11 for some Q&A. If you have a question, what we're recommending is that you enter your question into the chat. And Michael Riddersbacher has graciously agreed to go through those questions so that we can coordinate them and be as efficient as possible. And then once those questions are answered, we'll go for show of hands. Another bit of housekeeping, you know where the restroom is, and you know where the snacks are, so we don't need to be concerned about that. Today's topic is very, very dear to me. Personally, I have felt that grief has been a companion of mine all my life, starting actually when I lost a very close friend when we were in our early 20s, which was kind of a shock. And so I decided a long time ago that grief for me would be a companion instead of an adversary. And I think understanding grief will really help us in life. It certainly has helped me a great deal. So, Michael, will you also admit people? I don't know if I'll be paying attention at this point, so we'll rely on you.
I'll admit people.
Thank you. So we have an esteemed panel that I would like to introduce to you, and I'm serious about esteemed. Brian, would you wave for a sec? And all right, well, we're now sharing, so we're not going to have a full screen. What I recommend is that you can put yourself on speaker view, or you can minimize the video altogether and just get an indication in a very small little black box who's talking, so you can see the entire PowerPoint. So the panel, as you speak, would you introduce yourself first and then continue your presentation? So take it away. Who's first? Brian.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian DeVries. I'm happy to be here. I have Spectrum, and so my internet is going in and out all morning. So perhaps, Richard, you might cue up the PowerPoint just in case. My colleagues, Tom, Rob, Melissa, and I are happy to present to you this morning on Journeys Through Grief, and I'll hand it over to Melissa first for some further introduction and her part of our presentation. Take it away, Melissa.
Morning, my name is Melissa. So I just wanted to start with it kind of an introduction. So it has been said that loss is the other side of the coin of love. And with deep connection comes deep loss. And yet each relationship is unique and people respond very differently to loss. The same individual even will respond differently to each loss they encounter. When it comes to coping with grief, there are skills that can help you survive the path on which you find yourself. There are skills, there are maps, and there are guides. So with this presentation, we hope to normalize the varied responses that people have and to speak to some of those tools, thereby shedding light on the path ahead. So we thought we would begin with the language we use in relation to death. So when we say someone is bereaved, we are indicating that a loss has occurred of an important relationship, which has occurred through death. And when we speak of grief, we are referring to the reactions that people have in the face of death. We tend to think of grief as emotional, but of course, it is emotional. But there are other responses that go beyond emotion and encompass many other aspects of ourselves and our functioning. And even the emotions themselves may be varied, not just sadness or anger, but relief, regret, hope, and more. We might experience our grief in our bodies or work through it in our minds. How we behave and interact with others may shift. We might withdraw or reach out for support or busy ourselves with work or activities. In this process, we might finding ourselves assessing the meaning of life and death, wondering what happens after one dies, and contemplating our own mortality, as well as our spiritual or religious beliefs. Next slide, Brian.
Can they hear me? No. Oh,
Can you hear okay?
sometimes I
Yep, thank you. Yeah.
change my name.
Through time, many models have been proposed to explain how we work through grief. The model that most people are familiar with is Kubler-Ross's stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. She developed these stages through interviews with people who were dying. This is an important model because it helped us to understand that grief is a journey and that we learn how to navigate it by listening to those who are dying and those who are grieving. However, we have also come to know that grief is more nuanced. There are many other feelings and reactions that people might have, not just 5. With stages, people also come away with this idea that grief progresses in an orderly fashion, and that to grieve well, you have to move through each stage successively. But we know that that's not the case. The process is messier, it's individual. We may meander or backtrack or go in one direction or another and bypass certain reactions altogether. Kubler-Ross's model is a good foundation, though, and reminds us that grief is normative, that it is a process, that there are many roads to take, and we can learn by others' experiences and ways of coping. Next slide. So we chose to highlight a couple of other models that resonated with us, and the first of these is the dual process model. Rather than stages, there's this idea of oscillation, which in my mind, I thought of a seesaw. And that's because there's this up and down, back and forth process that one moves through with grief work. In the dual process model, there are 2 main orientations that one shifts back and forth between. When loss-oriented, the individual is focused on coming to terms with the death, incorporating the loss into reality. It is the knowing that this person is gone. It dominates early on and underscores the attachment to the deceased. You might ruminate, yearn, cry, reminisce, and feel alone. There could be denial, avoidance of even the idea of moving on without that person. When restoration-oriented, the individual is faced with the work of engaging life in the absence of the deceased. There are many things that might have to be mastered, shifted, or incorporated. One may confront loneliness and have to create a new identity, learn tasks that the bereaved person managed, or reorganize life. And feelings may range from relief and pride in your newfound skills and anxieties and fears about what's ahead. So though the focus is on the present and future and life, it can be stressful, and sometimes avoidance or distractions provide needed relief. So I think it's important to note in this model, denial and distraction on either end of the oscillation are not viewed as problematic, but rather tools to help you cope in the moment when the grief becomes overwhelming and you need a break. So we confront and we avoid, we oscillate back and forth, and that's okay. Next slide. Another model is that of continuing bonds. Obon is a 3-day festival in Japan where the spirits of dead ancestors are invited to come home to visit. And Klaus examined this model in his work with the bereaved. He found that death did not signify the end of relationships, but rather that there is this continuing bond, that there is a relationship that bridges life and death. And that continuing bonds exist for most of us. And how we live those bonds can help provide meaning and facilitate coping with loss. Brian, it's up to you.
Can everybody hear me okay now?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Good. Thanks. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks for setting that up, and thanks for being a part of our presentation this morning. I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about LGBT grief, to take what Melissa said and put it a bit in an LGBT context. As you know, I study LGBT aging, and I get asked a lot if aging is different amongst LGBT people than amongst other groups. And the answer is that there's lots of commonalities, but there are some differences. And those differences, I think, are primarily attributed to stigma. And those differences in stigma are also noteworthy in grief. For example, just as the legitimacy of our relationships appears to be appropriate discussion for courts, for some in our government, for some in our families, so too may our loss and grief go unrecognized or discounted. In such cases, it's as if nothing has happened, and we know how violating that can feel. I imagine many of you saw A Single Man, a movie of 10 or more years ago. The portrayal of the erasure in that case and its cost was really dramatic. And many of us know from our experiences in the early years of the HIV and AIDS crisis, where we lost so many of our brothers and sisters. Many of us stopped counting the number of funerals we attended in the 80s and 90s. And so there's a history here, a context, along the lines some have said of deaths and battles and the Holocaust, as Larry Kramer has called it. And we live with histories of these loved ones and our losses and discrimination and stigma. Coming out is a part of that. And some of us remain closeted because of that. Oops. So LGBT grief then could be characterized in a couple of ways. One is, and most commonly, a kind of disenfranchised grief. My colleague Ken Doka adopted this term. And the idea of disenfranchisement is that without recognition, there are kind of no norms to follow. There are few terms that characterize our grief. And as a consequence, support is less forthcoming. We all know that friends are kind of key figures in our lives and the lives of LGBT people, but they're really taken for granted and often treated as expendable. Few people, for example, receive a condolence card upon the death of their friend. Just think about it. There's a death in a family, cards come pretty freely. The death of a friend, it's rarely recognized. Even in the Handbook of Bereavement, a 400+ page volume, that's kind of the Bible of bereavement studies. When you look in the index under friend, friend is only listed as support to the bereft, as if the only legitimate role for friend is as support to a legitimate griever. But being disenfranchised means being not having access to those norms, terms, and reference, but it also means being unencumbered. It leads us to be free to find a path and support meaningful for us. A colleague of mine at UCSF, his name was Morton Lieberman, was writing a book on some of the interviews he had conducted with widows over his long career. He was going to call the book, and I don't think it ever came out, Must Widows Wear Black? And he was describing how in his interview he had heard women primarily feel forced into a pattern or path of grief. And if they deviated from that grief, they were seen as somehow not doing it right and encouraged to seek help. Without such a clear path, we as gay people, I think, construct our own meaningful rituals and support. For example, mainstream newspapers like the New York Times, even the Chronicle, refused to publish obituaries of LGBT people for years and years. And so we went to our own press, like the BAR, the Bay Area Reporter, for example, who would write up the obituaries of gay people in a way that celebrated these persons and our relationships. I remember one, we studied these for a while, and the headline of the obituary was "Ding Dong, the Bitch is Dead." And it was a really loving tribute to a friend who felt that he found Oz when he came to San Francisco. So I want to describe a little bit a study that we conducted several years ago through UCSF. It was a large study of 642 AIDS caregivers, mostly from San Francisco and LA, that were followed for up to 5 years. And these caregivers, over the course of those 5 years, all became bereft of the person for whom care was provided. Some of them became bereft multiple times, having cared for multiple people. In the course of this study, recognizing that the sad frequency of this loss, we included a question, an open-ended question about the appraisals of their experience. And here's a version of that question. It's sort of, how much is your life like what you had expected it to be at this point? When you think of all that you've gone through, your caregiving, your loss, how do you appraise your life now, and how is it how you might have expected? These were open-ended questions, and there were about 300 of them, 300 responses that my colleagues and I content analyzed. That is to say, people either wrote in these responses or spoke them to the interviewer, which were then transcribed. We took all of these transcripts, not knowing who had written them, and coded what were the kind of primary themes of what they had said. And here's one theme that which I wanted to draw your attention. And it's a theme that you might expect people to talk about in their grief, their kind of bereavement reactions. And this is really, I think, consistent with a loss orientation in that dual process model that Melissa just described, where people were talking about their sadness, their fear, their anxiety. And here it was about a quarter of the respondents used this as a theme to characterize their experiences. But it was in the context of these other themes that I think is the most dramatic finding. And that is that almost half of our respondents, as you see in this first theme, really talked about their experiences increasing their self-awareness. That they said they emerged from this experience with a renewed sense of life priorities, of focus, of sense of contentment and pride for what they had been able to do, how they loved and helped and cared for another person. About 20% spoke of their experiences in a way that we call generativity, a focus on relationship. And they said, I emerged from this with a renewed sense of how I want to be in relationships, the way in which I want to connect with others and for my community. And this might connect, I think, pretty neatly to this disenfranchisement and finding their own path. And finally, 10% spoke of their experiences in terms of kind of a new start. I'm using this moment to start fresh with a sense of future, of how I can be, in kind of tribute to the person who died, who I was able to help. And these other themes, I think, represent the restoration component of that dual process model that Melissa just described. So grief really provides a kind of in-depth sense of how we are, of how we think, how we find meaning, and how we seek and are in relationships. That is, in grief, we really ask ourselves, what have we lost? What are we grieving? And in so doing, we kind of dig deeper into our psyche and into who we are and how we think of ourselves. We see who we are in the presence of another and learn to see how others see us. I learned this kind of firsthand when my friend and former partner Bruce died several years ago. Upon learning of his death, I had to fly to Vancouver, as you would expect, on short notice. The ticket agent, even as she apologized for my loss, which I seem to tell everybody, also apologized for being unable to offer me any discount on this expensive last-minute flight. They did have a compassionate fare, but it was reserved for families, i.e. legitimate grievers. I got to Vancouver and spent a variety of days, several days, going through Bruce's belongings, reliving our lives together and what he meant to me. And in this process, I kind of also learned what I meant to him, and I realized what I lost in his death. I lost not only my friend, but I lost a kind of cheerleader, someone who really got me and who would say and express that in ways that I felt not comfortable doing. I realized that I lost the person I was with him, even as it wasn't always a person that I would choose to be. It was a valuable piece of me that Bruce brought out a kind of inner bitchiness in me. And it legitimized that in his presence, and that too was lost with his death. So through my experiences and with Bruce's death, I got a sense of both how my world, my social world, our social worlds change with the death of a loved one. And you can think of it as this mobile. Bruce or any loved one is a piece of this mobile being removed, which is necessarily throwing it off kilter. We spend a lot of time in ourselves trying to achieve a new equilibrium, a new balance, but so too is that true across other people who are grieving the loss of a loved one. They are grieving a different person, even if it's the same individual. And we're all struggling to kind of find this new equilibrium. We do that individually, we do that collectively in a network, in a family, amongst those who love this person as well. And it kind of introduces the notion of coping. And in that context, I return it back to Melissa.
So what do we really mean when we say cope? A formal definition is as follows on the slide. Coping is constantly changing cognitive and behavioral efforts to manage specific external and or internal demands that are praised as taxing or exceeding the resources of a person. There are pieces in this definition that I find important and would underscore as part of coping. The first is that coping involves change, that we cope when we're able to adapt. Sometimes when we grieve, we feel stuck, that there is no movement forward or through. Coping also involves effort. We can engage actively in coping with the way we think about things and what we choose to do. By actively engaging, we can feel empowered in our coping. What we cope with may be internal or external. For example, internally with loss, one might cope with emotions and how one is defining self. Externally, one might have to cope with new demands like learning to do things that you didn't have to do before. And finally, coping is subjective rather than objective, meaning that how one responds to and copes with the situation may be less about the situation itself and more about our relationship to it. For example, two people in a family may be faced with the same death of the same person, but respond entirely differently because how they appraise the situation and their own ability to handle it is different. Next slide. So to reiterate, when we experience loss, our reactions range across a lot of different domains of functioning: emotion, behavior, spirit, physically. And as such, our coping may also need to encompass these different domains. Next slide. So using the concept of continuing bonds, there are many creative and wonderful ideas for coping. These tools can allow one to maintain a continuing bond with intention, honor a relationship with someone who has died, and incorporate the deceased in meaningful ways into ongoing living, as well as make manifest one's grief and coping in constructive ways. Ideas may include ritual, remembrance, acting with intention, and sharing, to name a few. So from here, Tom and Rob are going to take it and discuss some specific ideas and things that other people have done. Tom?
Good morning. Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Melissa. I'd like to continue on this notion of legacy. My perspective is framed from more than 20 years as a hospice volunteer, and I'm also trained as an end-of-life doula. I realize that term might be new to some of you, but basically an end-of-life doula is a non-medical role. It's someone who provides support and assistance and guidance to the dying and those around them, specific to the person's needs, beliefs, and desires. Not all doulas do the same thing, but one key aspect of doula work is encouraging legacy activities. And as Melissa explained, legacies are intended to leave something meaningful to those who come after us, or conversely, to honor those who come before us. They can be big or small, they can be costly or not. The key point is that they're meaningful. Next slide, please. Legacy activities aren't a new phenomenon. One example is naming things after somebody. It can be babies or streets or parks, or the picture shown in the top in the middle. It's basically a cemetery bench where loved ones can sit and chat and reminisce when they're visiting their deceased loved one's grave. Scholarships can be another way to name something after someone. The local example up on the upper right, the Western Wind Foundation, this is a scholarship in memory of Anthony Zarati, who was a 22-year-old gay male from Cathedral City who died in 2017, and sadly after experiencing anti-gay bullying and harassment. This scholarship is awarded yearly to a student in one of the Coachella Valley's Gay Straight Alliances in the schools, with preference given those who have struggled with an anti-gay environment and have shown the resolve to try to rise above those oppressive circumstances. Capturing one's stories or perspectives about life is another wonderful legacy. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be as easy as pulling out a smartphone or tablet and audio or video recording what someone has to say, or encouraging the dying person to leave handwritten letters or notes for loved ones to be read later at special occasions. Writing to somebody, even if they've already died, can also be beneficial, especially if there's unresolved conflict, or even just to share your thoughts and feelings. Putting your thoughts on paper can bring feelings of peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation. You can then put the notes or the letters in a memory box, like a little picture in the bottom middle. Then you can pull them out and read them if you're feeling particularly forlorn, or you can just destroy them. Again, just writing down your thoughts can be very cathartic. Another type of legacy project is compiling poems or recipes or photos into a book or a file to share with loved ones. These days it's easy to get a professional looking book prepared, but sometimes it can be just as fun and perhaps more meaningful to do something handmade. That was the case with Grammy's cookbook in the bottom. While a lot of people will share their special recipes or their secret recipes or things that they're well known for, this woman focused more on things that she made with her grandchildren, really simple things, right? Crispy treats, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I think probably the most elaborate was meatloaf. But she included pictures of the kids. She included little snippets of stories from the kids. And the benefit to her was that she could include all of her grandchildren, even the ones that lived out of state. One of the cute stories was one of the kids mentioned rushing outside on Easter morning to see if the Easter bunny had peed. That was, of course, courtesy of Food Dye, but that's the sort of family folklore that probably would have been lost had it not been included in this cookbook. Next slide, please. Thank you. Repurposing clothing or fabrics is also another popular legacy item, like mom's apron or mom's dish towels into an apron, or flannel shirts into a comfortable throw. My favorite of this type is the one pictured on the left. If you notice the white shirt with the blue bow tie, and then there's a gentleman wearing that and below, and then on the left it's made into a pillow. Well, Jim turned 16 of his late husband Ron's shirts into pillows and gave them out to family members on Christmas Eve. Said it was a lot of work, but it was worth every minute. And as you might imagine, it was a very emotional Christmas Eve for everybody involved. And he said, so many people got to give Ron a hug, and many got to take home a little piece of him to hold on to. Pretty touching to me. The picture in the top middle, probably hard to see, but what it is, it's a box of chocolates with a bite taken out of each of them. And this example was provided to me, actually a local friend who's also a doula on today's call, told me about this. It's apparently this woman had a habit of when she had chocolate, she'd take a bite and put it back in. So I believe it was at her memorial service, they had boxes of chocolates and invited everybody to take a bite and put it back. Kind of just a fun way to remember her. And, you know, you could use probably anybody's favorite food or drink and create an opportunity, you know, just to remember somebody doing something as easy as this. Tattoos was another one that I was involved with. The picture on the right, there's 3 sections to it. This was for a gentleman who was about 44 and died 7 years after having had a stroke that he never fully recovered from. The tattoo, and several family members decided to have tattoos done as a tribute to him. The most left of them, the longer one, that was his younger sister. He had been in the Army in the bomb maintenance or mob, whatever that squadron was called. She went in the Army and did the same thing. So as her tattoo, she had his name and his date, birth date and death date, but then she also included that military reference that they shared. The upper tattoo there of the flag of California, the bear from that flag, this was his gay teenage son. This was the tribute he figured out for his father. He said his earliest remembrances were traveling to California with his dad to see his grandmother. And he wanted to remember those experiences that way. And I have a quick quote from him. He said, he wrote to his father, "I'll always miss the opportunity to not only be your son, but now that I'm growing up your friend, I miss you every day." And now when he misses his dad, all he has to do is look at the tattoo on his leg. The bottom tattoo there, that's something kind of new. I actually don't know anybody who's done it, but I've read a lot of anecdotes. It's an audio tattoo. If you have an audio clip up to 30 seconds long, you can have a tattoo made of it, and then you use an app and it plays the audio clip. The most touching one I've heard is of a woman who's probably 3 or 4-year-old daughter. If you scan the tattoo on the mother, you hear the child's voice saying, "I love you, mommy." And I've seen other ones where, you know, obviously spouses or partners, you know, say similar kinds of sentiments, but again, very touching. Next slide, please. This is probably my favorite example. This one, it's all about Mom Weekend. A woman who lived in Las Vegas, after she passed away, 11 months later, her family all gathered to do the unveiling of her grave marker. That same weekend, her 4 daughters decided that every weekend, that same weekend, every year, they would guess to honor and celebrate their mother. So they've been doing this a couple of years, and they share laughs and sometimes a few tears, but they tell stories, and they have a few things they must do. They have to go to their mom's favorite restaurant, which was Sammy's wood-fired pizza. They have to put stones on her grave marker, but they usually also add marshmallow peeps because that was a favorite of their mom's. And no matter what, they have to play their mom's favorite penny slot machine. So the weekends have helped them ease the sadness, and they're no longer grieving, but they're remembering and honoring their mother in a way that fits her personality. And I think that's the key to a great legacy activity or project. It's keeping it true to and honoring the individual. Thank you. Rob?
Put up the next slide. Thank you. February 22nd, 2011. The day my niece was killed in an automobile accident. Her mother has been grieving for the past 9+ years. At first, my family worried about her. She wasn't functioning well. The rest of us were expecting that she'd go through the typical stages of grief and at some point come to reconciliation and put her daughter in a loving compartment in her mind while she got on with her life. But she didn't. Well, surprise, surprise, she wasn't on the road to complicated grief. In fact, she was ahead of her times by unknowingly using the approach of continuing bonds theory and turning to Facebook to keep the relationship with her deceased daughter alive and to ensure that her daughter's memory would be sustained. Now, in the practice of grieving via social media, and by social media, I mean Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, when they emerged around 2010, it was considered weird, especially by the older population, but it was embraced by the millennials and Generation Z population, usually ages up through like 39. Of course, they've turned to social media for many aspects of their lives. And nowadays, grieving online is normal enough where it wouldn't be considered strange. It might be to us, but it's now the norm that a younger deceased person's Facebook page stays active as a way to remember them. And Facebook users, you may know this, can now select a legacy contact to manage the account after a person dies. So in this brief talk, I'll use my family and my niece's friends as a case study and how they used Facebook to help cope with the tragic loss and how it is consistent with the continuing bonds theory of grieving. Now, usually the nature of the posts is direct to my niece. It's like, I loved your killer smile, rather than posting, she had a killer smile. So those who posted were in a sense talking to my niece in their postings. Although there's no expectation that my niece would respond, of course, in the same way, but many believe that replies might come through other ways, like that little voice in your head, or coincidences, or dreams, etc., and that my deceased niece might guide and help them. So let's take a look at the continuing bond theory that Melissa explained, and let's look at the themes and see some examples of postings that represent those themes. Now, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, this was a post by a gentleman friend, and it was about 7 years after her death. And he says, "You came to me in a dream this morning. You were sitting on a bar top. Go figure. Just like we used to do. We immediately saw each other and you gave me the most amazing hug. You always gave the best hugs." Okay, in this section, again, he had a dream and my niece came to him. That was kind of a response. And then at the bottom, he says, "That hug will help me finish this year and start one amazing year. Thank you for coming to me. Thank you for whispering to me. Thank you for that hug." Again, here's now an example of him saying that, in a sense, she was giving him some guidance and some inspiration for the next year. So as we look at continuing bonds, it's established when survivors talk to my niece. And as I said, just about all the posts are like they're talking to my niece. Also, continuing bonds is evidence when they are incorporated into special events. Now, my niece's mother has a season tree. It's a tree she has up all year, and she decorates it based on the season for her daughter and some memorabilia of her daughter. And I mean like Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's Day, Easter, 4th of July, Thanksgiving, Christmas. I mean, she's redecorating that tree 7, 8 times during the year. And so that's a way of continuing the bond. When survivors experience her presence, and there are several posts about that, and I'll show you one in a minute, where they continue her legacy, where they share about her with others and use photos and art and mark her special day. Now, especially birthday, so many would wish her a happy heavenly birthday. But all of these elements really have been satisfied by posts to my niece's Facebook page. Could we go to the next slide and we'll look at one post. Here is a good friend of hers, and she just says, I miss both these activities with you. Is that really your tan, or did you roll around on a pile of Doritos? Well, I knew that my niece worshiped the sun. I didn't know she had an obsession with Doritos. But here you have a clear case where a friend is sharing with others an experience that she had with my niece. And in a sense, maybe it's even part of her legacy. Next slide, please. All right, this was a water painting done by her best friend. And it's kind of special to me. She says, it took me a while to do this because it hurts to miss you, but it's so good to see your face again, even if it's just on paper. So here's a very special bonding by painting a picture, sharing it with others. Again, another evidence of continuing the bond. And then the next slide, please. Okay, this is an example of someone who, I don't know, felt her presence, and it's in the top part of the post, where this was when my niece lived in Hawaii, and she had a good friend there, and they used to go to a particular beach. And all of us, and in this day, this friend was feeling her presence and saying that, you met me there, in the place you described like Hemingway. So much so, I had to go to sea. But I would totally cruise every beach in the world for those fleeting moments of peace. So it was an experience of her presence. She then actually went to the beach to experience the spirit of her friend. Now, in my reading of the hundreds of posts from the past 9+ years on my niece's Facebook record, what I've learned about her life is so much more detailed and more vivid than I ever imagined. I mean, her biography narrative has exploded. But then there's more. What else in Facebook makes it a continuing bond tool? Well, continuing bond can be inferred when there's a constant frequency and persistence of posts. Now, on the 22nd of every month, the day of the month that she died, her mother religiously posts, as do many of her friends. And of course, as I said, on her birthday also. Now, it's certainly clear that Facebook also is a way to construct a thick, durable biography. I mean, this is information coming from family and friends. It's a lot better than just one person writing a biography. But also, a continuing bond can be seen in the way in which people update my niece on everyday things long after her death. So this one here, I mean, this was, again, by a good friend. Now this is the bottom part. Today, I belted out to Tiny Dancer, driving with my windows down on a warm day in February, And tomorrow marks 7 years without you, my pretty-eyed, pirate-smiled true friend, until we meet again. So there were a lot of posts where people were talking to her about what they were doing and what they did with her. Continuing bond through Facebook, also where there is an investment in the maintenance of this bond. I mean, people checking it frequently, almost every other day. I mean, her mother is so gratified when her friends post, because she then says, I'm so glad that you remember my girl. So my niece's Facebook narrative is a record that obviously began during her life when she was posting, and has been added to and enhanced after her death by friends and family. It's a memory box that survivors can go to whenever they choose. So it's not surprising that people now are visiting virtual memorial sites more frequently than they do cemeteries. So there's no doubt that Facebook and other social media apps are changing the process and rituals of mourning in our society. And who knows what new technology will bring to our journey of grief. But for me, for my family, continuing bonds concepts coupled with Facebook has served my family and my niece's friends well. You may not want it for yourself, but don't discount the value of Facebook. Remember what Brian and Melissa said, grieving is an individual and unique journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. These are the references to two of the sources about which we've talked, and it's on the slide package, which we're happy to share with you as well. As we are to answer any questions or hear any comments you might have, I thank Rob and Tom for providing these poignant examples of the journeys and ways in which people memorialize, live with deceased loved ones. Melissa, for setting up the context of that. And I hope some of what I said gave an LGBT kind of framing for that, all of which is now open for discussion, and we welcome your input. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Melissa, Rob, Brian, and Tom. You've opened our eyes and you've opened our hearts. We really appreciate your being here. And again, invite you to join us at the PALS Cafe on Wednesday, where we will continue our discussion and ways to thrive and heal with grief. So thank you all very much. Michael?
Yeah, Tom, do you want to just talk about the Death Cafe maybe that's coming up?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just mention for those who may not know that PALS has a Death Cafe every month, and the next one is Thursday, November 5th at 2 p.m. The email went out on it yesterday. If you haven't gotten the email or you want additional information, you can contact any one of us by email or palsinthedesert@gmail.com, and we'll make sure that you get a copy of it. It's also posted on the PALS Facebook group and the PALS Facebook page. If you haven't been to a Death Cafe before, I really recommend them. I enjoy them. I learned something. Each one is different. It's group directed. There's no agenda. There's no guest speaker. There's no predetermined outcome. The people in the group decide what they want to talk about. It's usually cover a variety of topics. Each one is different. So it's something I encourage you to do at least once, and if you like it, do it more often. And again, we do them every month. Thank you, Michael.